Hello and welcome to the November 21 and February 22 Management Case Study examination read-through from a commercial perspective. The purpose of this video is to go through the case study for Frinter and think about the business issues that are coming up as a result of the Preseen information. So we're going to think about this principally from a business angle and think what issues this business is facing, and then use that to try and distill the type of issues that the examiner may focus on when deriving variance in the real exam. Our approach for a series of 4 videos in total will be to go through firstly from a business perspective, a commercial perspective, and then to go through the case 3 more times after this one read through, once for each of the OT papers. So from a P2 perspective next, then from an E2 perspective, and finally from an F2 perspective. Most of the issues will be discussed in this video, but we'll just consider the nuances relating to the different papers in the 3 videos that follow. You do well to remember that the Preseen is there to give you a level playing field with all the other students in the room. Usually on the day, it's the unseen information, the new information that you're given on the day, that is the focus of the questions you're actually going to be asked. The Preseen is background. You do need to know that Preseen, of course, because you might well need to dip into it to come up with some evidence, for example, or to talk about other issues that are affected by things in the question. But the reason I mention this is there's a danger that you become too obsessed with the Preseen. The Preseen is not something that you need to learn by rote and analyse it to death. It's something that you need to be intimately familiar with, but you don't need to go too mad on it. So before we go through this video, I'd recommend that you make sure that you've read the Preseen yourself. So if you haven't done so yet, I would then pause the video and spend some time having a read through the Preseen yourself, slowly and actively thinking what could come out of this. And then we'll effectively compare notes throughout the rest of this video. Before each of the OT focused read-throughs, I would watch the Practice Tests Academy revision video for that paper. So for each of P2, E2, F2, there are revision videos that are tailored towards the case study. So rather than relearning those subjects if you're going to sit the OT papers again, it looks at the content of the syllabus for those papers from the perspective of how it's likely to come up in the case study. So I'd recommend that before you go through each of the OT focus read-throughs, you spend some time to watch the Practice Test Academy revision video for that paper. They aren't overly long. They're a good, short, sharp refresher. Then after each of the OT focus read-throughs, you'll be presented with some specific example questions that relate to that OT paper in the context of the real Preseen. And then after that, we need to fairly soon get on to full mock exams, because at the end of the day, this is an integrated case study. The exam does not focus on one paper at a time necessarily. Quite often, several papers are being examined together, because at the end of the day, this is a work-based simulation. It's supposed to be replicating the kind of things that you might see in the real world, kind of problems that you might see in the real world that need to be addressed, and they don't necessarily fit into neat compartments of E2, P2 and F2. So you need to get onto those real mocks to look at the integration side of things. And those mocks that we have at Practice Test Academy are based on the real Preseen. So remember, don't learn the OTs again as if you're going to sit those papers again. You've already taken those and hopefully passed those. Learn through question practice. So occasionally when you have a go at a mock, there might be a technical area that you need to brush up on, and that's fine, but do it that way round. Don't sit trying to relearn all the OT syllabuses again and again. Now, remember the exam technique stuff that we've talked about in earlier videos. Let's just remind you of those briefly. First of all, TIPS, T-I-P-S, stands for timing, first of all. So have a look at the questions, break those questions down into how long you've got to answer them. So there are 4 tasks at this level, 45 minutes for a total task. Then it will tell you within the task how much time roughly to spend on each one. So use that timing as a deadline. Look at the clock and stick to that. So get your timing sorted out first of all. Make sure you've identified all the requirements. They are usually pretty clear, to be honest, these days in the exam. You do occasionally get the odd nuance hidden in the unseen information, but generally speaking, identifying the requirements is not hopefully too much of a problem. And what we're going to do here is plan in context. So plan on the screen. So as soon as we've identified the requirements, the first thing you need to do is get those headings on the screen. And the headings I would recommend you take from the requirements wherever you can, because the marking guide will be split up the way the question has been asked. So it's ideal if your answer can reflect the way the question has been asked as well. So ideally, use the question to give you those headings and get those headings on the screen in bold and underlined. If the question doesn't lend itself to headings, then you can use a suitable model that springs to mind when you read the question just to give you headings. And then think about how many points you need to write under each one of those headings. So we can assume that there's 25 marks per task. Beginners has 4 tasks in the exam. And then you can split those marks between the headings. What I generally do is assume 2 marks per point, but play it safe. So if I've got 25 marks for a whole task, halve that. So that's about 13. Add a bit on. Ideally, I would want to make round about 15 points or so, but it's only a guide, that, just to get you a feel for how much you need to write in total. Then split those between the requirements, usually pretty evenly, unless it's obvious that one is a much smaller question than the other. Then have a read through the unseen, the new information in detail, and as you're reading through, jot your ideas down under those headings. And then spend some time with those ideas you've got. Make sure you've got the right number. You've got them in a good order. You want to get the points first that are going to give the marker confidence that you know what you're talking about. So make sure you spend a little bit of time, only a minute or so, thinking about that. And then we're ready to launch in. Just remind yourself who you're speaking to here. That's the P in tips. The P in tips is planning in context. The S in tips is speak to your audience, which means think about who you're writing the report to, for example. And if it's a non-technical person, then don't throw loads of jargon in there. So timing, identify the requirements, plan in context, and speak to your audience. Now, when it comes to fleshing out those ideas into full points, remember to use the PERT idea, the PERT mnemonic. So write your point first, 1 point per paragraph. Write it at the start in bold, short, punchy language as a little phrase. Then put a colon after that and then explain what you mean and relate it back to the scenario. Bring in evidence wherever you can, either from the unseen or from the pre-seen information. Evidencing your point means it's very difficult to argue against as a marker if you've got some evidence supporting what you're saying. But add a bit of value in there. So give something back to the marker that isn't just a repetition of a fact. Think about consequences of your point, what else it affects, what other issues it relates to, and so on. So, point first, then explain and relate, and then the T in PERT stands for time. Try and get your point down there into a short, punchy paragraph. Don't waffle, in other words, because not only does waffling take time, it waters down your answer. So the quality of your answer will be improved if you reduce the word count. I'm not saying write in note form, write in full sentences, but make sure you reduce the word count. Anyway, hopefully you're all intimately familiar with those ideas from earlier videos anyway. Let's get on to the case study. Now, the case study, Frinter, there's a COVID-19 statement on the first page, which is worth just sort of taking note of, because as we all know, COVID-19 has pretty much dominated our lives over the last 18 months or so. And it would be very easy for every single answer you give in the exam to reflect COVID-19 related issues. And this concerns the examining team, that you're not going to be talking enough about other issues if you focus too much on COVID-19. So, as they say, the Preseen and the case study, although it's aiming to reflect real life, it's set in a world where the COVID-19 pandemic hasn't had an impact. So we can still talk about other issues and focus on other issues. But the examining team are keen to point out that any valid arguments that refer to the pandemic or social distancing, of course, will be marked on their merits. What I would say is don't let COVID-19 dominate every single answer that you put down, because you won't be exploring all the technical issues you need to get a pass in that case.